All right. Now you know I was telling the truth because the robot came on. Okay. Oops. All right. So good afternoon. My name is Sarah Milligan. I'm the chair of the Oklahoma Archivist Association Education Committee. I am also in my non-Oklahoma Archivist Association role, I'm the head of the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at the Oklahoma State University Libraries. So welcome to part 2 of this 6-part virtual workshop series, Archiving 101, Fundamentals of Collection Management.
Thank you, Charles.
We are so excited to see so many people participating in this workshop series. We're so excited to see so many people sign up for all 6 and keep coming back. So that's fantastic. This is a program of the Oklahoma Archivists Association, which, if you don't know or you're not familiar, is an organization to promote networking and education for archives professionals, students, and record keepers in Oklahoma. The series is also sponsored by the Oklahoma Department of Libraries and the Oklahoma Historical Records Advisory Board, or ORAB, with funding support from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission. I said this before the recording, but I want to go ahead and say it now while we are recording. We're going to be recording today's workshop for sharing later on in the Oklahoma Archivist Association website. You can also see past recorded webinars on the website under the resources tab. So that's for the past, for 2020 and 2021, we've done a series of virtual webinars or information sessions that you can see there. In addition to session 1 of this series, which is already posted there. Another thing I want to share about is the Oklahoma Archives Bazaar, which is coming up very soon. That's another Oklahoma Archivists Association initiative. The goal of this event is to inform the public about archives in Oklahoma. So this year, the bazaar is going to be entirely online, which is something new for us, where archives from around Oklahoma will and can share information on recent or notable collections, as well as just general details about your organization. So if you are part of an archive and you want to share in this format about something cool happening, or just something interesting, or just more about like what it is that's your mission of collecting and why people would want to come check out your stuff, you can see more information about how to participate on the Oklahoma Archivists Association website. But the 2021 Archives Bazaar theme is archives and popular culture. So there's going to be some really fun things happening. So on to today's workshop. Session 2 of this 6-part is bringing in new collections. We're going to be talking some about provenance, which is identifying information, physical custody, and intellectual control. Today's session is led by Jennifer Green. Jennifer's a longstanding archivist and archives advocate in Oklahoma. So after beginning work with the Oklahoma Historical Society in 2007, just as they were opening the new fancy building they're in, she worked to establish and led the manuscript division at OHS before leaving to serve as the first municipal archivist for the city of Oklahoma City. While she was there, she oversaw renovations to create a record storage area for permanent documents. She managed an National Historical Publication Records Commission funded grant project to help or to pay for support inventorying the holdings and conduct records management training for city departments. She's currently working as an archivist for the Oklahoma Department of Libraries. She's also a family member, it's family to me, a founding member and recent past president of the Oklahoma Archivists Association. For those of you who don't know, the OAA was established in 2017, so we're still fairly new. She's also a member of the Oklahoma Historical Records Advisory Board. So I am really excited to pass this over to Jennifer Green. And can't wait to hear from you more, from all of you more. We're going to ask that you, there will be points where we ask for questions, but if you have things you want to share in the chat, we will definitely be keeping up and managing and those questions forward as well. So Jennifer, I'm going to pass this over to you.
All right.
Thank you, Sarah. And I do feel like we're a little bit of family. That's totally fine for you to say. Thank you for that lovely introduction. We're a very small archives family here in Oklahoma, so we have to keep it close, right? Thank you all for coming today. I'm excited to share some information with you about bringing in new archival collections. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides and we'll get going. Are you seeing my Zoom control? There we go. So last week, we talked about collecting with purpose. Just a quick overview of session 1. We talked about the collection policy, value of records and the different types of value that records can have, and also the act of appraisal, which is determining that material is useful and necessary for your repository. So today we're going to follow up on that discussion by talking about what happens after you get that in your door. So we're going to assume that you've already been over your collections policy and you've cleared this accession for inclusion into your repository. And we're going to talk about legal ownership and the transfer of that, physical and intellectual control, and also documenting your acquisition and different ways you can go about doing that. So just to begin, I wanted to make sure that I clarified some terms that I use throughout. Repositories, I struggle sometimes with archive repository language because so many of us are at different types of organizations and I don't want to leave anybody out. And I also don't want to say libraries, archives, and museums every time. So I like to go with repository, just so you know that includes everybody who's collecting and potentially taking in some materials, which is my next term, the stuff, which I like to just call materials because it kind of also is a catch-all for everything. And I just wanted to also point out that the word accession can mean as the action of taking something in, and it can also describe the collection itself. So it means both of those things and is used interchangeably. So a few things you should consider when you're accessioning new material is that you want to have a designated location in your repository for this new stuff to come in. You never know what it's going to look like or where it's been, if it's been in a barn or an attic or somewhere that could have water damage. And you don't want to introduce those threats to your storage area. So it's nice, even if it's a corner or a closet or a desk or something that's outside of your storage area where you can receive these new materials for at least having a little look at it to see what kind of condition it's in. You also may want to consider, if you find something harmful, having a separate location for isolating those materials until they can be dealt with. You also want to develop some procedures as far as rehousing or deframing or how you're going to physically handle the stuff once it comes in as an accession. Some places like to just do nothing, where they'll give it a number and then stick it on the shelf in the boxes it came in. But you may like to put it in fresh boxes. You may have a limited space where you need to take framed items out of the frame in order to store them, or just however that policy may come about for you, it's worth considering. Also, are you separating your accessions by format? And this is something that larger institutions will do, and sometimes smaller ones as well, where you'll take out photographs and other materials that may have different storage requirements than paper items. Next week, Holly Hodson-Friends is going to talk about some of those elements for storage and maintaining those materials and providing some longevity for them. So these are not things I'm going to go into more detail here. I could talk about a lot of these elements in a whole session, but something to consider when you're thinking about bringing in your new items. So legal ownership is just that. It gives you title to those materials. Since archival holdings are largely unpublished works, there is an element of copyright and other intellectual property rights to consider when you have materials that you may want to publish or reproduce in some way. If you do not have ownership of materials, it can be a real liability to your repository, because whoever donated that or the source of that material could then come back and say, I'd like to have that back now. And if you don't have legal ownership of that material, you have no ground to stand on. You have to give it back to them, even if you've processed it, even if you've encapsulated things with Mylar and other expensive supplies, you would still have to return that collection. That's kind of the second point too, disagreements with the owner, donor, family, legal action resulting in litigation, which could get in the news, and none of that's good press. Also, which leads to loss of trust from the public or donors, where they think, well, they don't have a very good handle on their collection if they have just lost something to a former donor. Ownership is also required a lot of times to make reproductions and do publications. That sort of agreement is definitely required for materials of all kinds, photos, AV, text. Also, I just wanted to kind of mention, and I put a link in here about orphan works, which are materials that you may have without a gift agreement. And this happens, unfortunately, to everyone. I think, along the line, they just maybe missed it that day. Someone forgot to get a signature. It's half filled out. If you don't have a gift agreement for it, then it's considered a founding collection or an orphan work. And there's a lot of different resources on how to deal with those things. And I've linked just one of them, which is a statement from the Society of American Archivists about that situation. So you might be wondering, what about a loan? If somebody says, here, I have this wonderful material, it's timely, it will fit in with an anniversary or a situation happening that you might want to exhibit. And it can be useful for that, as long as you make an agreement that you write down like a contract and actually have them sign. Loans of research material are really not beneficial to your repository. Again, you might need to process them or do, have staff time and effort invested in those materials that then will go away to the owner or to some other facility. It also kind of breaks the chain of citations if someone's actually going to reference that material at your repository, and then years later, somewhere down the line, someone's looking through their citations and they see it's at your repository. If it's no longer there, or if it's at some other place, then that breaks that chain of information. So when you do bring something in, you want to document all of the elements that you can. Document your transfer with a deed of gift, which is the most common, or a gift agreement. The purchase agreement can be used if you pay a collector, or if you pay a family, or you purchase something through an auction house or an antique dealer. And record of transfer is typically a type of document used between different divisions of the same company or agency. And on that document, you want to get all the who, what, where, and when. And this is a legal binding contract. So it is something where you can define issues like publication, disposal in the event of deaccessioning or weeding a collection, access restrictions due to confidentiality concerns, or other special requests that the donor may have. And you really never know what those special requests may be. So while it's important to have a boilerplate gift agreement, it is also something that you can alter and customize if it benefits your repository and it's a collection you're really, really interested in having, and you've consulted your legal counsel about it. If you have someone you can ask or a lawyer to run it by, is always a good idea. I put at the bottom there a link again to the Society of American Archivists, which gives some other links and some resources on creating a deed of gift if you do not have one. So these are the basic elements that you want to be sure to record on that document. You want to have all the information you can about the donor, which we'll talk about in my next session. Number 4 has to do with provenance and chain of custody. You definitely want to know where this stuff came from. part of that is also an issue if the donor has the rights to give to you, as they may be the uncle or the cousin or the descendant of the creator. And so sometimes those relationships require a little bit of exploration as well. The date of your transfer, obviously summary of your materials, what are you getting? Statement of transfer of rights. And that you'll see pretty standard on a lot of the gift agreement examples online, where it says, I so-and-so hereby, give you these rights, which are mine to give. And that's a legally binding statement. A statement of access restrictions agreed upon by a repository. And I keep bringing this up, even though it's pretty rare, it's good to be prepared for that discussion with the donor, because sometimes people want that. And you can either refer to your collection policy, which will give you some leeway on saying, well, we really would like to have this in order to share it. And that's the reason that these materials are here in our repository. Or you can say, yes, I understand your confidentiality concerns, and we can keep this certain aspect of your collection or the certain part restricted for a number of years, or until following the death of maybe the donor or the donor's family member or something of that nature. So those things are possible to negotiate, but again, it has to always be in the best interest of both parties. And if a 99-year or 100-year restriction is not really benefiting researchers or the public, because it's just going to sit there, you essentially don't have it at all. A statement defining use of the materials. So that is something, as I was saying before, about exhibiting, publications, other things like that. I've had experiences where writers or other creators of creative content will donate their personal papers and say, okay, you can include this in your publications, but I want to retain also the right to publish this material. And that's something that you can sort out, again, with legal counsel to define. Disposal criteria and authority is also really important. So, you take in this collection, everyone on staff and administration and your collection agreement or policy agrees that this is something you'd like to have 100 years from now. Your donor base changes, your board of directors shifts focus, something happens, and suddenly this is no longer within your collection policy. And the staff at the time looks at it and says, well, we'd be better served to transfer this to another library or archive. And something along those lines in your gift agreement will give you the authority to do so. And this also gives the donor a little peace of mind, because you bring it up and you say, in the event that we ever want to get rid of this, deaccession this from our collection, would you like to have it back? And it gives them the opportunity to say they do, or no, we trust you to go ahead and transfer it to another repository or whatever that end might be. And obviously you both have to sign. So I'm going to pause a little bit and just see if anybody has questions. I can't see the chat. There we are. All right. Then we'll go ahead to section 2, which is physical and intellectual control. So physical control is, obviously just taking that material in, getting a good look at what you have, and deciding if it needs rehousing or if there are preservation or other issues that need to be dealt with. Knowing where you're going to put it, that you have room for it, that you have supplies to rebox or manage that collection. Intellectual control is the other side of that, which is knowing what it is that you have and how it came to you and what is in there for your repository. So documenting all of these steps is very important, and really getting to it as soon as possible is very important. So that's why I put the note in here about accessions piling up, because it really can get away from you pretty quickly. I'm sure, like me, you all have a pile of this and that in your home office or somewhere in your house where you think, oh yeah, I'm going to get to that. And then as time passes, the pile just gets bigger and it's not doing anyone any good. And then it feels more difficult to handle. So it's best to really just get these things jotted down and saved as soon as you get the thing in. So once you get it there, you want to have a bird's eye view of your collection. So first thing you want to be sure of, is this a brand new collection or is it an addition? So sometimes you'll have donors that will give a little bit of something and hold stuff back, and for whatever reason, or maybe they might get some more things from another family member and then bring it in later. And so you can have additions to collections you've already received. And those need to be documented as such. So if they're all from the same creator or the same source, it will also help you with naming your collection and understanding how to best give that group of materials an identifier that reflects the real content of what you have. Something else you can take note of at this point is if there are large groupings of things in the materials that make it, that are natural groupings. Say there's a large series of correspondence, there's a bunch of business letters, then there's some personal items, and then there's diaries, using textual examples, but it could also be the same for photographs. If you had someone who was a journalist or a news photographer versus someone who may be into doing nature photography in their free time, and so then they have their business and personal items, which may or may not be separate in that collection, but it could be something that you could identify at this point, which you would also document, and then again, help you provide access to. And do the materials have any preservation concerns? Have they been wet ever? Can you see water damage at all? Are the boxes in decent shape? Are there any evidence of pests inside? If there's anything nibbled or any droppings or leavings from other types of visitors in the boxes. So again, everything preservation wise should be acted upon immediately, or at least pause your accessioning so you don't get them mixed up in your larger collection. So like the gift agreement, there's a form or part of your database data entry for this collection, which is all of the accession information. And so the accession number is your unique ID. And that is something that your repository may have established system for based on the year it's come in, and then a sequential numbering is the most common, but any type of unique identification will work. You want to be sure you include the date that you are making this accession, and that's the date you're recording all this information, not the date that it walked in the door, because that may not be the same. And that's part of the history of this collection. All your information about your donor, and then the collection title. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that on the next slide as well. How much material you have, and if they're boxes, oversized, volumes. It's really important here to be detailed because this accession may sit for some time before it gets really processed, before it has a proper finding aid, or before it gets included in your permanent location guide. There's any number of things that can cause an accession to be left behind or sit for a long time. And if you have, one volume or one piece of it not included in this description, then it may be lost. So it's very important to categorize everything as it physically appears, so you make sure you have a full picture of the whole collection. And then, just a brief description of what's in there, because this is going to help you with your processing plans and your work going forward. And if you do have a location where you want to stick this and you're already ready to include that information, you can do that. And your location may be accession closet or accession desk or accession shelf. Even if you have a temporary location, that's just fine. A location is a location. So real quick about naming, I just wanted to share some of these examples because there are a lot of options and it may not seem like there's a difference in those terms, but it can indicate something about the collection overall if you use the term records versus papers versus collection, especially. And some repositories may not follow this practice and some may. And that's again up to you and your procedures at your facility. Most importantly, though, collection can indicate that something's artificially compiled. It was not or something that was created as a whole. I've made a link to this finding aid for the John Dunning Political Collection. It is an example of something that was purchased from a individual who goes out and collects materials on certain subjects, and that's a artificially created collection. Does anyone have questions about physical or intellectual control? So I put a couple questions just up here. The addition, if you have an existing collection, again, this is a policy decision for your repository. Sometimes there'll be an additional delimiter between that original accession number and say a part 2 or 3. And some repositories will just give it the same number again and just continue that box series. So again, as in archives, it depends really on your repository's policy. And if the materials are damaged beyond repair, you better call your donor back right away and say, just be honest, really, this is looking water damage. There's a lot of pest damage here. I'm not sure we can accept it. Would you like to take this back? Just deal with that immediately. So from this point, your documentation also includes a larger collection of forms. And I'm talking about these like they could be pieces of paper, but they could also be elements of your database, which is maybe a proprietary project or something like Archive Space, where you have different data input screens for all this information. So regardless of how that occurs, if it's electronic or if it's on paper, you'll want to be sure and include all of these pieces of data that I've talked about, even if you cross-reference them, file together or separately. I see your question, Karen, and I'll answer it in just a minute if that's okay, because I'm gonna keep going with this one. So for your donor file is all about where this collection came from. Your accession file is what it looked like when it walked in the door. And then your collection file is another thing, which entails what you've done to that collection after it walked in the door. So these are 3 steps where they all reference the same materials, but from a different angle. So sometimes they're all filed together. Sometimes they're separate with references to each other by the accession number or other elements by the donor name. So now that we have electronic records, it's much easier to keep all of this data in one place together. You may have a paper file that's a legacy collection file, which would be worth looking at as far as digitizing and seeing how you could connect it to your current collection, just so you know what you have in an overall way. So we had a question come in from Karen. She says, generally speaking, if items such as books have ephemera, notes, correspondence, etc. within, are these kept in the item as they were received? And this is a question which is appropriate for accessioning, also could be appropriate for when you're processing. Both times you could encounter this. I would say, personally, if whatever's inside the book is not harming that other item as far as being more acidic or having some other chemical makeup that's going to deteriorate the paper, if you leave it in the book, I would say leave it in the book. That's how it came in. That's what it is. If you want to separate it, you could absolutely do so. And you could use what's called a separation sheet. And it's basically just a little note that you would put in there and say, handwritten note, see folder 7, and give a reference to where that piece of paper ended up. It makes more work for you. And if it's not harming the book, that's why I try to go the path of least resistance and make sure you get the accessioning finished rather than trying to do a bunch of work like that in the beginning. So that's a really good question though. And that may be something worth discussing among other archivists as far as what are your feelings on that? To me, I feel like notes in bound volumes and things like that really are part of the item and can reflect, the character of the creator and the environment from which those things came. And so to me, it has value. Obviously, if you leave it in there, you also run the risk of a researcher just looking at it, popping it out, and then never putting it back there. It could end up in the folder with the book. It could end up in a different place in the book. So, these are things that you have to decide case by case if this is a collection worth really poring over as far as documenting those contextual elements, or if it's something you're not too worried about that happening. So that is actually the end of my slides, because I didn't want to have 1,000 slides of me talking. I'd like to have some questions from you all or some more discussion. We have plenty of time. We can always get out early, but I'd rather talk with you all if you feel like it. I've included the citations for 2 books that I used making these slides today. They're both from the American Association for State and Local History, Archival Basics and Archives 101. They're both really great publications, $50, I think, a piece. And they have examples and really wonderful appendices that go along with them. And then there's a couple of just general links below that.
All right, you all are welcome to put things in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask questions, throw out scenarios. If you have, I'm gonna go ahead and stop participant sharing so we can is that okay?
Yeah.
I think this is also a good opportunity if you have your own scenario maybe in front of you that you want to talk out. There's a few archivists I see in here too, that I know it's always interesting to get multiple perspectives on scenarios, which is sort of what you're talking about with Jennifer. But I think this is the time to do it. So what are you all working on?
Hi, y'all. I'm Nicole, and I'll just share one little story that might drive a point home. We had gotten a bunch of diaries from a lady who kept 30 years worth of diaries. She wrote every day, and she wasn't anybody important, really, but there were interesting things in her diaries because, they're from the 1920s and 30s, like got my teeth back in the mail today, sort of that kind of thing. And somebody found, one of her descendants found them and came and wanted to see them. And of course, we pulled them out for them to look at. And then she decided she wanted them. She wanted them back. She wanted us to give her these 40 diaries back. And fortunately, we had the paperwork where they had been given by her ancestor. But had we not had that paperwork, and she had proof that those diaries, were her family's, we'd have had to give those back to her. And because we had the paperwork, we didn't. So all of the stuff that Jennifer has shared today, while it might seem unimportant, legally, it can be very, very important. So you want to make sure that you keep track of everything.
Record keeping is important.
That's what we do.
Yeah, it is important. And that's a really good example, Nicole. Thank you for sharing that with us. That's something that can absolutely happen, especially with family members that come in and see something and maybe they didn't know that was there, or they just decide they want it back again.
Mhm.
So that gives you some legal standing to have a conversation about keeping it. So, oh. Yes, there are a number of templates online for gift agreements and deed of gift. Again, it depends on your repository policy and what you're taking in, the specific wording that you will need for that. I have one link on the slide that I shared, which I believe is from the Society of American Archivists, but there are quite a few more out there as far as templates for those contracts. And that's something that you may contact a repository, someone that you know, and say, hey, can you give me a copy of your gift agreement? Just so you can see what other people are doing in your area. Copy that for you. So this is the link, which has a guide to deed of gift, talks about the transfer of ownership and other elements. It doesn't actually have an example, like I thought.
I also think it's important to frame today as sort of like the step in the process, right? So it's not necessarily, well, you talked a little bit about how it might move forward into processing. Like at this stage in our conversation, we are not really at collection processing yet. It's really just laying the groundwork for when things come in, what are all the things that you need to be working on for your checklist, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is important to recognize just in the element of completing that accession in a timely manner, because an accessioning isn't processing. You're not going to go through each box. You're not going to pull out folders and go through them and look at things to describe them. You may do a little bit of that as far as poking and prodding and looking around, but that's just to make a 2 or 3 sentence description of, you know, these are the business papers of XYZ, or these are the personal writings and diaries of this person, in order to describe that in a general manner. So someone looking at that accession record can just know essentially what those things are. You know, you can add some tags to it if that's something that your software supports. So if you're looking through your accession database thinking, okay, I have a new volunteer and they're really into baseball. What do we have regarding baseball that this person would be super interested in and enjoy processing? So then you can look those things up in your accession database because you've tagged it with the term baseball. It doesn't really matter exactly what's in there, because that's where your processing and your finding aid and your full inventory will come in. You just want to make sure you get it all documented and on the shelf where you can find it again, because that is your number one goal with accessioning, is all of the paperwork, all of the information is completed. You know what you have and you know where it is, because you might accession it and stick it on a shelf and then go off to another job or take some time off or whatever happens, and someone else needs to be able to get to that material more than they need to have a very detailed description of what's actually in there.
We had a question in the chat from Heather. What should be done if you are new to an archives and cannot find the accession records for legacy collections, or if it is not as complete as you think it should be? That's a good follow-up to what you were just talking about.
Yeah. So you're saying, what if you don't have access to them?
I think what if you don't know if there are any accession records, if there's legacy collections, this is not an unusual situation, right? Like you're working in an
Right.
institution, and maybe there's some collections that are available, but you don't have any of that accession information. Like what might be your first step?
Well, your first step is probably to just investigate the material and try to find out, if you can, where it came from, if there's any clues on the material itself as to, some of your older legacy collections, if there's anyone with institutional knowledge or someone who said, that you think might know where that came from. Other than that, unfortunately, there's not a lot you can really do as far as finding out who that donor is. Sarah, do you have any other?
I think maybe the extension of that is, and then what, right? Like, so it's what point do you decide whether to keep something or whether to try and return it? Is it, I think part of your investigation, if you really can't find out anything about like a box of stuff that's left on a shelf where you're working, right? Like you have to make some institutional decisions about risk assessment for even maintaining that information or providing access to it. And some of that I think can depend on what the content is. Like if the content is very personal, has identifiable information about people, that can sometimes help you try and trace down who might know more about what it is. But also if you just decide to provide public access to it without really trying to get permission or better understanding of what the intent for it being, and that you could kind of get in trouble if you don't do your due diligence. But also every step of the way, if you're really trying to track that down, you want to document what your process is, even if it's just in like a file folder that you started for that bundle of stuff, which is I talked to this person, they didn't know, right? Like I identified these 3 people in these images, I tried to contact them and couldn't find them. Like whatever it is, you have to document those steps, and at some point you have to decide as an organization how much time and effort you can afford to put into tracking stuff down like that, or whether you want to try and figure out what a deaccession process for, you have an accession, but what a return process or even disposal process might look like.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And that also, I think you were right on the head, hit the nail on the head with your documentation as far as who you talk to and what you try to do as far as finding out that information. If you decide it's something you want to accession because it's really fantastic and it doesn't pose any potential confidentiality breach, then just make that very clear on your accession record and say, this was found in collection. We don't have any donor information. We tried this, that, and the other thing. We can't find anything. And it could be something where later a relative or a business associate or someone sees it, and then you can make those identifications. But your best bet is always the whole story of what you've tried to do and document every element of that. And in addition to that, you can put on a caveat that says, this collection is restricted from publication. So at no time will you be falsely representing your legal rights to that material, because you can share it, you have it. So that's the possession factor. But making a duplication or a publication is where you would cross that copyright line and start having some legal ramifications. There was also a question about, do repositories have to attain approval from their trustees or boards for gift agreements? And this is something that I know happens in certain facilities. If you're a private organization, or if you have a board of trustees or a government entity that manages your overall facility administratively, then it is possible that is something that would need to be attained. But those choices are made by the bylaws or the operating procedures of that repository. And so everyone's a little different as far as how those decisions are made. I think that would probably be part of your collection policy or the administrative policy of the facility. Trying to think of what else.
I was just gonna jump in, this is JJ, and say that not everybody will have access to a database type software, but even if you just keep things in like an Excel file or some Word docs to go back and look at, that is a beginning point where you can migrate that data. I know for us, when you were talking about accession records and unnamed collections, sometimes we found paper copies sitting in the top of boxes when we started actually digitizing things. So don't always look in the box, even if it's a legacy collection, because there might be something in there that somebody placed on the top of it saying, hopefully this will help you in the future. So
That's a really good point, JJ, about trusting or not trusting the label on an old box that you might find. Absolutely always look in the box. Yes. And follow up with trying to find that accession document if you can, because the dots may not connect. You never really know until you look at it. That's why it's so important to keep that documentation. And along the same lines of rights statements and securing that legal ownership, documenting everything that you do as the archivist is important in the way of reformatting or removing items from enclosures or other things that you might do, which is more along the lines of processing, but it is something that you could encounter during accessioning. And it's good to document all of those things you do because it changes the item a little bit from how it was received. So documentation is key for all of these elements. Absolutely. Just write down everything that you did and why. And that way someone later on won't be wondering what happened.
How important is the concept of original order at this point? I know that sometimes when you're coming into archives management, that's maybe the one thing that you've heard that you need to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Which
And
is
I
a
think
complicated thing, but
it really is, because it kind of, like you were saying earlier, it really kind of straddles that boundary of accessioning and processing. But it is something you can absolutely take note of if you see it at this point. But it's something you risk disrupting if you go in and rehouse as far as rebox. There could be information on the box that has some clues of this creator's intention or how these materials came to be. So, I typically, like I said, like path of least resistance is always my motto. If the box is fine and it fits on the shelf, go with it. Just pencil your number on the corner and let it be. Creating more work for yourself at this point is not what you really want to do. A term that has been widely used in my archival career is the mark and park. So you basically get it all written down with the number on the box and on the shelf, because as we all know, we have a lot of duties to take care of, and fine comb through something as it walks in the door is just not feasible. And you may want to, and it may be really cool, but in the same way, you have all these other obligations and things to get to. And so be realistic about it. But yeah, that's a good point, Sarah, to bring up about original order and what it looks like when it comes to you versus when it's actually processed. So yeah, if it looks okay and it's doing all right, I would leave it alone. If you can look at it and see you have a natural progression of documents or materials that show a certain order, you can go ahead and number the boxes at that time, or not at all. It really just depends on what you see. And when you start doing this, you'll get better at it and it'll get faster and these decisions will be easier to make. But in the beginning, it does feel like a lot. And again, that's where it's good to have that robust collection policy that you can go back to and look at and say, definitely this is all worth keeping. This is what we want to have. You know, we're going to put it on the shelf because we want to process it later, not just getting it out of the way, but a little bit of both, probably.
Well, we have a few more minutes in case anyone has any other scenarios that you have in front of you that you're walking through. I think the resource that you shared, the Lois Hamill book, Archiving 101, I hadn't seen that. That was out. I actually used to work with Lois when I worked in Kentucky. So
Fantastic. Yeah, I really like that one. It's very straightforward and it covers all the elements and it gives a lot of examples. It's a really great book. If anybody else has questions right now. I'm going to go ahead and share with you my final slide, which is a little advertisement for the American Archives Month, which begins tomorrow. Hooray. October is American Archives Month. This is the 2021 logo from Society of American Archivists. And as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, OAA has a biannual Archives Bazaar, and ours is all online this year. So please visit okarchivist.org for more information about that. Also at the top of my screen right here, there's a grant application opening tomorrow on the library department website. I put a link to that. This is the American Rescue Plan Act. The state of Oklahoma has funds to provide for anything pandemic response related. So if you need to buy new furniture that is easily sanitized, maybe it's vinyl instead of upholstery. If you need to buy PPE, if there's something you need to do for your admissions desk, like plexi or anything, kiosk to, for entry or for registration of patrons, that's a touchless, where you don't have a contactless registration for your patrons. Any of those things, it's funded up to $5,000. There's a pretty broad area where you can request a grant for. So please check that out. I think it's open for a month, and that's our archive, library, museum, tribal, all sorts, government entity. So please check that out. This session is sponsored by the Oklahoma Historical Records Advisory Board and the NHPRC. Also plug for that. And next week, we'll hear from Holly about the preservation environment and making sure your new materials you just brought in have the longest life possible. Thank you for coming to the session. And here's my contact information. And if you have any questions or would like to follow up about anything I've talked about today, please feel free to contact me.
thanks, Jennifer. I really appreciate your time and your expertise. I will share the slides from your presentation with everyone who is registered for today, and we will put up the recording probably sometime in the next week. So in case you need to come back or share with someone else or sort of see all this in succession, you'll be able to do that. Other than that, we'll see you next week if you're coming next week. And you can always reach out for questions as they come up.
All right, thank you.
Stop the recording.